has been really fascinating to hear, particularly for me, the material about the national narratives of both France and the Netherlands, because there are just so many similarities with Britain. And I am a historian of Britain and its empire, and my focus for the last, I don't know how long, feels like a long time, has been on trying to rethink and rewrite and teach differently and learn differently what the history of Britain is. So deconstructing the national narrative, which is just as powerful in Britain as it clearly is in the Netherlands and France. And the national narrative in Britain has been one of liberty, freedom, a freedom-loving people, prosperity, peace, no conquest, no violence, no expropriation, a peaceful story from beginning to end, a transformation from barbarism to civilization, but one that has been done in an extraordinary and English way, which means recognizing trouble when it's coming and dealing with it before it happens, reforming in time, and therefore the slow march of progress. And that Whig story of English history is still phenomenally powerful. And indeed, at the moment, we face a particular new set of, the argument, there's been an argument going on in Britain about the nature of British history for a long time, certainly for the last 20, 30 years, and the ways in which new populations in Britain, whose history is it, who does it belong to, what stories are being told, that argument's been going on for a long time. And there are small successes and defeats, and it goes on, and we keep fighting, and the contestation is in rather a critical phase at the moment, because the Minister of Education, who's a man called Michael Gove, is particularly enthusiastic about the national narrative and is trying to rewrite the syllabus taught in schools to go back to a story from 1066 onward, progress to where we are now. Chronology, kings and queens, parliament, politics, and take out all the progressive elements that teachers and educationalists have worked to insert in these last decades. So that argument is actually currently happening in Britain. Well, 2 weeks ago, a landmark decision was made when the British government agreed to pay 20 million in compensation to the victims of British torture and imprisonment during the so-called Mau Mau Uprising that was part of the struggle over decolonization and preceded Kenya's winning of independence. So several thousand Kenyans were compensated for torture and abuse in that period, and they had been campaigning for decades. And the case turned eventually on the evidence of historians as expert witnesses, and particularly a man called David Anderson, who's a historian at the University of Warwick, who had discovered a tranche of documents that the British government had smuggled out of Kenya in 1963 and that had remained completely hidden in the National Archives. Nobody had realized that they were there. And David Anderson traced them, and a judge then ordered their release, and they revealed a horrifying record, devastating evidence of the systematic abuse of prisoners by the British. Well, this record was not destroyed because of the unease of a whole number of colonial officials who were concerned about what was being done in the name of Britain, and also who were very worried that they might get blamed. And therefore, they wanted the record to be kept of the fact that these orders came from the cabinet. They came from the very top, that these forms of abuse should be used. And so this tranche of documents which, I mean, it is actually completely typical of the British Empire that very good documentation is kept. And that's been very, very important for historians because of making it possible for us to find things out that otherwise might have been hidden. I mean, part of the record is telling us that, you know, very senior people are saying, this must never be known. You know, if we're going to do this, it must be kept secret. But somebody writes that down because it's seen as, you know, it's proper to keep records. So anyway, this is an example of the importance and the political relevance and the significance of work that historians can do. And one of the questions that, that Rosie and Esther ask in their introductory remarks to the conference documents is they say, it is our duty to remember, but we also need to use that memory work, if possible, to empower and sustain, and, you know, to be actually able to use it. And so I wanted, in this talk today, to think particularly about the forms, I mean, in these very, very bleak political times in which we're living, the triumph of neoliberalism, the rise of far-right groups across Europe, the scale of Islamophobia and xenophobia, the persecution of the Roma, the scale of new forms of racism as they're being practiced across Europe. This is actually the challenges that we're all facing, whether, you know, in whichever part of Europe we are. We're in a very dangerous and bleak situation, and we need whatever sustenance we can find from thinking about the past and its relation to the present. What forms of food there are for us to think with, to think critically about the present. So, well, I've said that the British government is very good at documenting. The British Empire is very good at documenting what it's doing. And the work that I've been doing with a team at University College in London for the last now 4 years, and I'm very happy to say that despite the extremely unsympathetic political atmosphere, we continued to get substantial public funding, which is a triumph. What we are doing is tracking slave ownership in the Caribbean particularly, and in Britain. And the source, the way we started this work, was that in 1833, when slavery was abolished, £20 million were paid in compensation to the slave owners. And that money was, every claim on that money was written down, it was checked, a record was kept of it, and a record was kept of all the people that the money was paid to. So there is a huge collection of documents in the National Archives which have provided the basis for the first phase of our study, which is most of what I'll talk about today. We're now into a second phase, which is on an earlier period. Those documents had been drawn on by particular historians working on particular case studies. So, for example, the Trinidadian historian Eric Williams used it in important ways in his classic study, Capitalism and Slavery. But Eric Williams could only do case studies. You know, he was one person, and he was working on a whole range of things. So nobody, until we started doing the work we're doing, had used these records systematically. But because we now have computers, and because we had a team of people, we were able to do a systematic piece of work on these records. And what we've done is to digitize everything that we've found and made that into a publicly accessible. I'll go on to the next one, then go back. This is our website, which we launched at the end of February, and which I'm very happy to say went viral and went global. We had, within the first 2 weeks, we had over 100,000 hits on this website from all over the world. So it's something that is capturing a great deal of interest. And what we've done in this database is to document, first of all, the 47,000 claims that were made for compensation. So we've simply named all those people. In Mauritius, the Cape, and the Caribbean. The claims are being made in those areas. And then we've done biographical work on the 3,000, the group called the absentees, who are the group of slave owners who were living in Britain. They were living in Britain and living off the fruits of slavery. The slave trade, of course, had been abolished in 1807. Slavery was not abolished until 1833. And these 3,000 absentees, we followed as much as we can, and we have examined their a whole series of legacies connected with them. We've tracked the commercial legacies. So, for example, we've established the importance of compensation money that went into the railways, into marine insurance, into merchant banking, into investing in other parts of empire. Of course, you understand that money is fungible, so we can't actually say this is compensation money, but we can say if somebody receives £10,000 in compensation and that year puts £10,000 into the railways, which were being built at exactly that moment, obviously it's likely that there's a connection between these two. We can make those kinds of connections. We've looked at the political legacies of this group of men, and I'll say something about that actually, about gender, because very interestingly, one of the things that we've found out is that of the 47,000 claimants, in the Caribbean, nearly 50% of the claimants were women. Women slave owners operating on a very significant scale. Most of those women only own small numbers of enslaved people, whereas men own much larger plantations and properties. So they tend to be small owners, particularly in urban settings. They're often renting out their enslaved property to work as servants, for example, or in hotels and restaurants, that kind of work, or on the docks. So a very high level of female ownership in the Caribbean. And in Britain, amongst the absentees, about 25% of those absentee owners are women. So this is a really significant point because slave owners are nearly always thought of as men. I mean, if I can just go back. This is our logo from our project, and this is a fragment from a cartoon that was done. It's John Bull with his hat on, John Bull, the symbol of England, and this is one of the slave owners taking out of his pocket the 20 million. So the 20 million pounds came from taxpayers' money, which was raised mainly by the Rothschilds through raising bonds across Europe. So here is our typical slave owner, a man, but actually a lot of slave owners were women. So we've traced the commercial and financial legacies, the political legacies, and there we've looked particularly at the ways in which the West Indians, as they're called, and West Indian in this period means white West Indian. West Indian only comes to signify blackness in the 1950s in the British context. So West Indians, who Eric Williams, when he wrote Capitalism and Slavery, he thought that the West Indian interest, the importance of the plantocracy was finished by the time of abolition, that they were no longer a significant political or economic presence. But he's not right about that. They remain a very significant presence, and they retain a lot of political influence for the next 20, 30 years. So, for example, they are able to hold on to protective sugar duties for the West Indies for a very long time. We've tracked their presence in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the ways in which they operate also in county politics across the country. And very significantly, they play a really large part in ensuring the legitimate introduction of indenture, which of course is the main form of unfree labor which follows after emancipation. So once you start thinking about emancipation as a process, which a never finished process, and you start looking at the ways in which forms of unfree labor continue and are developed, indenture is an old form of unfree labor. It's existed from the 16th, 15th, 14th centuries, but it accrues a new form in the period after the 1830s, as it's used as a very significant way of bringing South Asian labor from India, another part of the British Empire, into particularly Guyana and Trinidad. And that's why Guyana and Trinidad now have a completely half and half population in terms of people of African descent and people of South Asian descent. So those slave owners, or they're not any longer slave owners, those West Indians are very important in the political debates around indenture. And one of the figures one of the great protagonists of indenture is indeed John Gladstone, William Gladstone's father. William Gladstone became the famous Liberal Prime Minister of England. William Gladstone was a great supporter of slavery right up to the last moment, very supportive of his father's ventures in Guyana. And John Gladstone was one of the wealthiest slave owners at the time of emancipation. He got over £100,000 in compensation. We've also looked at the physical legacies of these men and women, the country houses that Patrick Ayres has been talking about. We're doing as much work as we can to establish their presence in relation to country houses. The townhouses, which they build, £20 million in 1836, 1837. Of that £20 million, nearly half of it stayed in Britain. Nearly half of it went to a very small number, relatively, of claimants who are the absentees. Of the 47,000 claimants overall, 3,000 are getting nearly half the money. And that money is coming into Britain. And so imagine that amount of capital being released at that time and the potential it gives to new investments. And of course, that was Eric Williams' argument in relation to both the slave trade and slavery, that the fruits of the slave trade and slavery were critical to industrial takeoff in Britain. And that thesis has been systematically, or attempts have been made systematically to undermine it ever since Eric Williams published it. We still have people now saying to us, Williams, absolutely, rubbish, completely disproved by all these US historians who've shown that economically it's untrue, etc., etc. Our evidence and the work of a group of other economic historians, particularly the Africanist Joseph Inikori, are demonstrating again how important this money that came from the slave trade and slavery was indeed to industrial takeoff in Britain, which of course then has its impact right across Europe. In terms of the actual wealth, we estimate that the wealth then of the slave owners has been very much underestimated, and that its significance in terms of overall British wealth has also been systematically underestimated. On our estimates, between 5 and 10% of the British elite in the 19th century have wealth associated with slavery. So that's between 5 and 10%. We are not saying that Britain is built on slavery, but we're saying there is a very significant input. There are many other forms of exploitation which are being utilized in the making of the development of capitalism in that period. But slavery, which has been played down, is very significant. Then we look at the cultural legacies of these absentees. The money they poured into art collections, which of course are even now hanging in private collections and national collections in Britain. The book collections they did, actually, of course, lots of these have been bought up in the United States. New forms, more modern forms of cultural imperialism in practice. The philanthropic work that they did, the philanthropic institutions they established, and the money they put into that, these are all part of the legacies of this compensation money. We've also looked at the imperial legacies, the ways in which money from compensation goes into new ventures in particularly the colonies of white settlement, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the Cape, which are developing fast just this period, and I want to come back to that in a bit more detail. And then the historical legacies, which has been the particular part of the research that I've worked on. The histories, the novels, the poetry, the prose that these descendants of slave owners and the slave owners themselves wrote, the ways in which, in the immediate aftermath of slavery, they disavowed it, they rewrote the history in a whole variety of ways. Once slavery was ended, they celebrated the ending of slavery, regarded it, this goes back to what Wayne Modeste was saying earlier, it became the past. It immediately became the past, and something which you didn't want to remember. What you wanted to remember was abolition. So what has been commemorated in Britain so much has been abolition and not the slave trade and slavery. And the slave owners themselves contributed very powerfully to this way of thinking, this form of the memory work that they did played significantly into the reconfigurations of race after slavery, once the figure of the African could no longer, once he was no longer, he and she were no longer the enslaved figure, which fixed inferiority in a particular kind of way, new ways of reconfiguring racial difference had to be elaborated, and the descendants of slave owners play a significant part in doing that discursive and ideological work. Well, okay, can I have another 10, 15 minutes? All right, so I'm just going to give you, I mean, all that is pretty general. I'm going to give you an example from two particular brothers. And maybe I should just say, I wanted to show you just an example of what the listings of compensation look like. These are just straight lists which were produced for Parliament. Daniel O'Connell, the great liberator in Ireland, who was also a great supporter of anti-slavery, asked that Parliament should be provided with listings of who had received the compensation money. So this is the first kind of form of the documentation which we had, which is then backed up by all the other more detailed material. This is our website to show you and to encourage you to go and look at it. It's being utilized, as I said already, by an extraordinary number of people who are finding all kinds of associations that they did not know and are demonstrating through that the entangled histories which we share, the entangled histories which we share. These are not neat histories of slave owners, bad slave owners, and the separate body, the enslaved. These are absolutely the histories of the ways in which these two groups are fundamentally entangled, so that the history is one which we occupy, of course, in unequal ways and in differentiated relationships, but it's a common history for Britain and indeed for the Caribbean. Okay, so my little vignettes that I'll talk about. Charles Kingsley, very well-known British literary figure, historian of the mid-19th century. Charles Kingsley's mother was a woman called Mary Kingsley, and Mary Kingsley's father came from a family who had been in Barbados for 5 generations. So they're a great West Indian line, a dynasty, a West Indian dynasty. Her father, Mary Lucas's father, had properties in Barbados. He was a judge in Barbados, and he also had properties in Demerara. And at the time of abolition, we can trace the money that he received, but the properties were in debt. And his grandson, Charles Kingsley, always maintained that emancipation had ruined him, that the ending of slavery was a disaster for his family, that the compensation that they got was a meager representation of what they should have had. I should have said that the compensation was precisely for the people, for the men and women. And those men and women were priced as commodities, their value judged on the basis of the levels of productivity and how they varied across the territories. So, for example, an enslaved man in Jamaica was worth, in compensation terms, much less than an enslaved man in Guyana, because the levels of productivity in Guyana were much higher because it was new territory, had only just recently begun as a sugar plantation area, and therefore the fertility was at a very high level. Whereas Jamaica, which had been a plantation society from the late 17th century, the land was worn out, the yields were low. So, all of this is done on a systematic calculations, all of the records of which we have. Well, Barbados was an old colony, so the levels of compensation were not very high. So Charles Kingsley had grown up with stories of his grandfather, Nathan, and indeed he knew his grandfather very well, and he loved his grandfather's stories. And his grandfather would tell him stories about how he had been with Admiral Rodney on his ship, the Formidable, when the French were beaten and the British West Indies were saved. So this was a great heroic story of a great moment in the struggles, in the global struggles between England and France for control over the Caribbean, in which the English triumphed. And Admiral Rodney's statue, great marble statue, stands in Spanish Town in Jamaica, the celebration of the saving of the British West Indies. So these were the kinds of stories of the triumphs of the past which Kingsley grew up with. And despite the fact that he became a Christian socialist, he was very involved in the whole discussion about what was called the condition of England in the 1830s and 40s, the worries about mechanization, the worries about the divisions between rich and poor. He became a fanatical supporter of sanitary reform, seeing that as a way of improving the conditions of the working classes. But he also had this passion for the Caribbean. And his brother-in-law, these are all family stories. And family is an absolutely building block of the organization of colonialism, of the organization of plantation society, of the organization of wealth, and of capitalism. Family is a building block because in the 18th and early 19th centuries, there is no limited liability. Everybody is relying on family and kin to organize their managerial labor forces. So Kingsley's brother-in-law was another historian called James Anthony Froude, well known for the horrible book he wrote about the West Indies in later years. And Froude believed very strongly that the English had become effete and effeminate by the mid-19th century, and that it was important to try and revive a spirit of patriotism, of vigor, of masculine strength, of valor. And Kingsley completely agreed with him in all these aims. They were both very, very influenced by Thomas Carlyle, who also shared this vision of effeteness and anxiety about the decline of the English spirit. And Froude wrote an extremely, I think it's 15-volume history of England, which focuses on the Tudor period, on Elizabeth as the great monarch who launches the colonial enterprises, and on the figures of Drake and Raleigh and Hawkins. Hawkins, of course, the initiator, one of the initiators of the slave trade, as the heroes of the English Empire. And Kingsley wrote his version of this heroic narrative in his novel Westward Ho, which was a fantastic bestseller in the 19th century. 32 editions were published between the 1850s, when he published it at the time of the Crimean War, and the 1890s. And it's a heroic tale of these kinds of galleons and young white men with blonde locks heading out from Devon and Cornwall, where, of course, you get good Celtish stock but become civilized, heading out for the Caribbean, encountering the barbarism both of the African enslaved and of the American Indians, all of whom Kingsley represents in the kinds of ways that you can imagine. So a heroic tale of imperial adventure. Well, Kingsley's brother, Henry, who was younger than him, also wrote tales of colonial adventure, but his adventures are focused on New South Wales. And he, like many sons of West Indian families, once the West Indies was no longer seen as a very profitable place, which it was not for the most part by the 1850s and 60s, they started going, or before that, they'd been going to Australia, to Canada, to New Zealand. And when we started tracking colonial officials in Australia, for example, goodness me, you know, here are all these sons of slave-owning families and descendants of slave-owning families. And all our contacts in Australia start buzzing with, oh, have you seen, you know, didn't know that he came from there, etc., etc. So anyway, Henry Kingsley goes off to New South Wales, and he's a terribly unsuccessful settler. He was hoping to make his fortune, but he doesn't make his fortune. So like his brother, he starts writing, and he goes home to England, and he sits in a little cottage in his brother's back garden, because he has no money, and he writes a wonderful colonial romance about New South Wales, which again was sold very, very well, and is seen as inaugurating the whole genre of colonial romance in Australia. So he's very well known in Australia. And of course, the groups that he is describing are, on the one hand, the settlers, who are solid, hard-working, blonde, of course, men and women who work hard, establish huge sheep farms are very prosperous, etc., etc. And the shadowy, haunting presence of Aboriginal people who gradually, in his 2 Australian novels, in the first one, they're kind of there. In the second one, they literally have become like shadows. They have been dispossessed. So the dispossession of Indigenous people is right there in Kingsley's Australian novels. So these families who are moving from, of course, having dispossessed Indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, but for the most part, that's happened some time ago, through slavery into new forms of unfree labor and dispossession and expropriation in other parts of the empire. This is a long history. Well, I've got to stop. 5 minutes. I'll just tell you what happens to these two. I mean, I cannot tell you how truncated this is, but there we go. In 1865, there was a very significant uprising in Marant Bay in Jamaica. And this man, Edward John Eyre, was the acting governor in Jamaica at that time. And he and the white colonists, always living with the spectre of both Saint-Domingue, Haiti, and the so-called Indian Mutiny in 1857, were completely convinced that this was a war of blacks against whites. And they responded with absolute brutality. And the rebellion was put down extremely brutally with the use of martial law. And it became a subject of great controversy and conflict in Britain, the debate over Governor Eyre and what had happened in Jamaica. And Charles Kingsley, like his friends Carlyle, Dickens, Ruskin, took Eyre's side. They were supporters of Governor Eyre, whereas a group of mainly the scientists and John Stuart Mill, led by John Stuart Mill, tried to prosecute Eyre and critiqued Eyre. Henry Kingsley published an article in Macmillan's magazine at exactly this time, which celebrated Eyre as a great explorer. Eyre, the man who had crossed the Great Australian Bight, which was a completely unknown to the colonists, of course, territory. And of course, the way in which Eyre managed to cross the Great Australian Bight was that he had Aboriginal people with him who enabled him to cross it and to find the water holes and to get back to, quote, civilization. So Henry Kingsley wrote this piece about Eyre and what a great man he was and what a protector he was of Aboriginal people in Australia. And this was used in the controversy. It became, it was particularly used in the columns of the Times newspaper as to whether, how this was a demonstration of actually Eyre was a good man. So both of them got embroiled in the Eyre controversy. And remember, this is 1833 is emancipation, 1865 is Marant Bay, 1865-66 is when the controversy is happening. And when we look down the lists of who supported, the supporters of Carlyle and Governor Eyre, we find a whole number of names of the descendants of slave owners. So the continuities politically of these people over time in terms of what they are representing and the kind of political work they are doing and the causes they are espousing are right there. Well, finally, what sustenance do I get from this story? Well, I think the most important thing really is the way that for those of us who are trying to rewrite the national narrative in Britain, it goes to the heart of British society. White people are completely implicated in this story. And since a central strategy, as has been talked about both in relation to the Netherlands and France, is distantiation, didn't happen here. Something awful happened to those whites who went there. They become, you know, the heat affects them, but they become different. They're no longer properly English or British people. That form of distantiation is impossible once you see the ways in which these absentees benefited absolutely directly, the ways in which the money and power were part of British society in this period and continued. But secondly, so that's to insist that this is a white history as well. But secondly, what's been very dramatic is the ways in which we've actually seen how it gives Black Britons, obviously particularly African Caribbean people, a sense of enfranchisement. They can see the ways in which their labor, the labor of their ancestors, is embodied in modern Britain. It helped to build the railways. It built those country houses. It's actually in those streets in Bloomsbury, and so on. So we've done many sessions with Black British people who, you know, they see that this is, yes, our history, which crosses those binaries, which crosses those divides, which never undoes the colonizer-colonized distinction, but complicates it and puts us in the same bag historically. This is a history we have to live with together. We have to find our forms of reparation and restitution together in this bag, which is colonialism and all its legacies. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for a very inspiring, it's my first sentence, and thought-provoking summary of your work. I'm certain that for many Dutch, your talk contains moments of recognition and comparison. Avoidance and denial of the impact of race and racism can be found here too. And one example in Amsterdam is the Van Loon Museum that contains a lot of what were called blackamoor statues and pictures, but they are immediately denied as such. Not slaves, has nothing to do with slavery. This is a very, and the Van Loon Museum today is still in a way, they're confronting their history, but in a very limited way. Well, maybe we can talk about that later. You began with the recent history of the British government acknowledging the abuse and torture of thousands of Kenyans and the agreement to pay out compensation, £20 million, the same amount as what was paid in 1833, remarkably. It brings to mind a similar event last year in the Netherlands and Indonesia, where the surviving widows of a village, Rawagede, were also recognized as being in their right to compensation by the Dutch state. Here, the initiative and the persistence to continue this case in court came from activists and lawyers, in particular Liesbeth Zegveld. And the recognition by court in The Hague was a significant victory. As far as I know, there was no direct involvement of historians in researching these cases, but the case of Kenya and that of Rawagede point out that there are now opportunities for combined historical and legal initiative for the victims and descendants of historical injustice. It is not unlikely that these more recent cases from the European decolonization wars may pave the way to readdress injustices from longer ago, in particular in the history of the slave trade and slavery. They will require substantial and careful research and action, and I'm convinced that there is more possible, that we are in a time when more room is being created. My question to you would be, do you see signs of a movement to historical justice? What about the reparations debate in the UK? You have not mentioned this in your talk, but are there or have there been attempts to initiate legal action by or on behalf of the descendants of the enslaved against the descendants of the enslavers? or their firms or estates or against the authorities? As a specialist on 19th century cultural history, do you see an increase in a sense of responsibility, a sense of shame or guilt with respect to colonial memory? And can we compare the British abolitionist campaigns playing on the sentiments of shame with campaigns today? Do you see progress or merely stagnation? My second remark is about the state of historiography. In your paper, you didn't mention so much in your talk, but in your paper you sketch a divided and polarized field of historians who are either defending empire as benevolent and largely beneficial, versus historians whose perspective is that of a more critical approach of colonial exploitation and abuse. This is also very recognizable here in the Netherlands. And sometimes the division almost appears a division of labor between schools of scholars. Can you tell us in this slide more about the first reactions of historians to the database and website of your project? I think you're quite right in mentioning this as a history that is forgotten, overlooked, buried almost, but as we hear from all the speakers here today, also very present. And that is the promise of unearthing this history, localizing this history, digging it up and showing it. And therefore my project has become in a direct inspiration of your project. I saw a little Google map on your website of part of London where you had mentioned where the slave owners lived around the university area of University College London. And that inspired me to make, with a group of students, a map of Amsterdam, where the slave owners in Amsterdam were living in 1863. So I think that remapping slavery in the forms of actual maps, Françoise Vergès spoke of cartographies, but I mean literally mapping, may be a way to bring history much closer to Europe, much closer to the actual European cities where the decisions of the slave trade and slavery were made, on the kitchen tables and in offices, on firms here. I think maps and the soil, the ground and the floor plan. So maps and floor plans are what I'm interested in and what I want to gather and make. So in this way I think we can remap slavery and the slave trade. And the very first example of that came from Esther Captain with her map of Utrecht and her guide of Utrecht that we now all have. Similarly, I think for this conference could be a good starting point to make a map of the Asiento. Who were all these Asiento holders? There were not just a few, but quite a few people who were the actual families who held the Asiento for a few years. And by putting these families and firms on a map, we could visualize the impact of the history of the Asiento in European cities. Apart from that, I'm also thinking about emotional maps. We see that the history and memory of slavery and the slave trade is not only an economic history. I respect very much the work of economic historians, of course, but I think the emotional history and impact is something that we have to address. So how can we put the emotional history on a map? This is a question for the audience. I don't know exactly how to do that, but I feel that there is something in emotional mapping that we might address. Because pride and shame have an impact in this history and in the memory. And I remember Paul Gilroy's address here, when he became professor here, when he spoke about the impact of shame and the power of shame during the abolitionist process in the 19th century. So shame can have an activating power, can have the power of feeling more responsibility. It can have that way. If it worked to some extent like that in the 19th century, it might work today. So how about shame? I think it's important to recognize and use national specifics. It has been addressed here already that, and Esther in a way is the embodiment of that the memory of World War II is dominant in the Netherlands. And it can be referred to as a narrative of freedom, of struggle, of resistance, but also as collaboration. And so I think in the national Netherlands memory work, we can work we can combine the memory work on slavery and the slave trade, and I think it's possible to build a less contested, a more mainstream form of memory, and that we could include that as part of European history, memory and present. So we would be looking for common ground and common effort. So altogether, I think I want to thank Catherine for her very significant input and inspiration in this work. And finally, I would like to invite those of you interested to the presentation of new maps of the history of slavery next Wednesday at the City Archive in Amsterdam. Lianne Leonora is one of the map makers. She will present a map of Curaçao. We have new maps of the Netherlands, of Amsterdam, and of The Hague and Haarlem. And that is at 3 o'clock at the City Archives on the Vijzelstraat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dienke. Just to make a quick remark on the widows of the Indonesian Rawakaday case, you wonder whether there were historians involved in this whole process. And yes, there were. Historians were asked to, as a way to testify, which also make us think of our role as historians as expert witnesses. How do we do and deal with that? Catherine, would you like to comment briefly upon what Dienke has been saying? And then we give the floor to the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Dienke. And, you know, it's wonderful to know that these collaborations are building across Europe. Let me say something just briefly about reparations. For a lot of people, the point of our work is that they can make a stronger argument about reparations. Reparations is an issue in Britain, though not on a very significant, not on a huge scale. But there is a stronger movement building in the Caribbean around reparations. And the argument that's being made there is very much in terms of the importance of investment institutionally in the legacies of inequality. And this seems to me completely the right approach. We have, when we first went public, the media leapt upon the fact that they could trace that, you know, Samantha Cameron's fifth cousin 3 times removed was a slave owner kind of thing. That, in other words, sort of being able to, they wanted to name and shame. And we do not want to name and shame. That is absolutely not what we are interested in. We're interested in establishing the record and that being of use to people and that demonstrating our entangled histories. Not saying, you know, this person got X amount of money and therefore they owe something now. Clearly, there are questions for individuals because there are families which have survived into the present, and you know, we can see them. But we do not want to name and shame. And well, maybe that's all I need to say about reparations. Well, when we first started the work, we were criticized in the Caribbean for turning attention to individuals and taking it away from the state because it was state responsibility. And of course it was a state responsibility, but what we were interested in doing, as I've described, is establishing the historical basis for being able to demonstrate the significance of these legacies through the 19th century. Do I think there is more, I'll just say something about this, do I think there's more responsibility about colonial memory? I think, as clearly in the Netherlands and in France, it's a very, very patchy picture. And in some areas you can see some changes, and in some areas you can see some regression, as, for example, in relation to the history syllabus that I was talking about. In 2007, in the context of the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, there was a huge flourishing of activity. Local museums, national museums, local galleries, artists, community groups. I mean, a massive amount of things happened. And once 2007 was over, nearly all of that just disappeared. And we don't even know where the records of any of much of the work that was done have been kept. So there is a kind of, what's the issue of the moment? And interestingly, next year, as we all know, there are going to be massive commemorations of the First World War. And of course, the British government has put far, far, far more money into that than they put into 2007. But a lot of work has been done on the colonial involvement in the First World War, and that's quite recent work. So that's a new area coming up. I'd just like to say something about one of the ways in which the record has been systematically disavowed. And that is that in Britain, as I expect in every European country, we have a dictionary of national biography. And this is, the great who have made Britain what it is. And in the dictionary of national biography, there are literally hundreds of slave owners, and virtually none of them are recognized as slave owners in even the new dictionary of national biography, which has been done very recently and gone online. So that's a way in which that history has simply disappeared. Sometimes they're described as West Indian proprietors, or occasionally, which was of course the term they wanted. Sometimes they're described as families who'd fallen on hard times because of, the decline in the Caribbean, but actually saying what the wealth was, where it came from, and all of that is just not there. And we're getting one or two entries now that are beginning to shift that very, very slightly. So that would be one of the ways in which a really important form of national collective public memory, everybody uses the Dictionary of National Biography. It's a really significant place to try and shift the ground on.
I'd like to look at the audience and see whether there are a number of people with questions. Please go ahead here in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Marant, and I was triggered by the fact that you said there were many female owners within the Caribbean, specifically as I've heard many stories about families being broken within the slave trade, the history of broken families within the Caribbean continuing up until now. And I was wondering, were these women who were female owners single? Or what was their role within British society, or the Caribbean societies actually, the colonized societies?
Well, the women in Britain who claim successfully are nearly all widows. And they're living on modest incomes, which are derived from enslaved people in the Caribbean. So, for example, there's a woman called Dorothy Little who's living in Brighton, and we know a little bit more about her because she writes several times to the commissioners telling them what a parlous state she and her children are in because her claim has not been yet yet been met, how they rely on this money, how they're living off this money. I mean, at no point in this correspondence is there any kind of recognition of what this property really is. So the property, you know, at the moment, of course, of transformation into money, it does, I mean, it's there in the records that the money is because of 5 enslaved people, or however many it is. But what's actually given to the claimants is cash or a check, you know, so it does literally become money. And so most of the women in Britain are in that kind of situation. They're living on annuities, they're living on income left to them by their husbands. In the Caribbean, it's very different. And there are certainly, up until the early 19th century, there were really quite significant large-scale landowners who are women, mostly the illegitimate children of white fathers and enslaved mothers, who have then managed to build up property, usually starting as lodging housekeepers in the towns, and gradually increasing the scale of their ownership, and then being able to buy land. And an Australian historian called Cassandra Pybus has been working on this for many years now, and she has accumulated a series of accounts of these women and the very considerable wealth and influence they had. But nowhere can she find subjective material. There are no narratives of these women. They appear in the records as property owners. The wills tell you things, etc. But she cannot find letters, diaries, journals, you know, the things which allow us to explore the emotional histories and the gendered subjectivities of these people. It's really, really hard to find. So it's limited what we can do. But there's more interest growing in this area and more work being done.
Elazar Barkan. I have a question that can easily be misunderstood, so let me try and put it in the right context. It's a wonderful multi-layer and multivariant paper that you give, and I have questions about the economics that you describe. I can understand the surplus value that they extracted from the slave economy before the abolition. But you talk specifically about, and I can see the 20 million pounds being distributed to transfer in the economy, transfer payments from the general public in England to a particular class that then you trace its impact on politics and all the other aspects of that. What I don't understand is, why do you characterize, or how is it characterized, that the 20 million pounds were actually slave money rather than what today we would call quantitative easing, by which, as you described, the Rothschild sold bonds, which means that it's paid by the empire, it's paid by the British economy in general, but it is not specifically extracted as a slave capital. So before that, definitely. The social, political, cultural impacts later, definitely. What I don't understand is that particular sum. How is that economics, the economic contribution of slavery per se to the British economy and to what you said, the railways and the industrialization, which, if I understood correctly, refer to that specific sum?
Well, one of the joys of working on this project is that we're a team. And I am definitively not an economic historian. I'm a cultural historian and political historian. And we do have an economic historian, Nick Draper, whose book, The Price of Emancipation, was the first phase, really, of this project. So forgive me if my answer isn't as technical as it should be. Of course, I take your point. And the money isn't literally money raised by the enslaved. It's money that is paid, that is raised by the British government, as I said, through bonds. But it's paid because it's seen as a debt to the slave owners, because it's seen that it's the responsibility of the nation that slavery has existed, and that therefore the slave owners should be compensated. So although it doesn't literally come from, as you say, but I don't see that that really, I'm not sure what the implications of that are. That wealth comes into the economy because of the stain of slavery. And the West India interest, the initial, I mean, there's a very interesting negotiation that goes on about how much. And the West India interest bargained very, very hard over this, and very, very successfully. Initially, the British government were planning to provide a loan of 5 million. The slave owners were arguing from the early 1800s onwards. They argued for compensation in relation to the abolition of the slave trade, and they didn't get it. So from then on, they're making the case about compensation, and especially, of course, in the 1820s, when they see that there's no way they're going to avoid this happening at some point. So they managed, in the last months before abolition, to raise the amount from a loan of 5 million to an outright grant of 20 million, which is a demonstration of their political power, clearly. And they also, the second part of the deal that the slave owners won was that the enslaved were not freed, they were renominated apprentices, and they had to take between 4 and 6 years to learn to be free laborers. The process of civilization was going to take, another 4 to 6 years. So in addition to the 20 million, the slave owners get the unpaid labor of the apprentices for a further series of years until that's finally abolished. So I know that doesn't, I'm not sure really what you're asking. I mean, it's clear that that's how it's done.
I don't want to prolong. I mean, I'm happy to explain, but for instance, the questions of reparation. So descendants of slaves would have a very strong case for claims of reparations of all the extracted labor that was unpaid for, and the suffering and the pain, etc., including those 4 to 6 years which you just described. This is wealth that is extracted by slaves who are not being compensated by, and against their will. It's a different proposition that the 20 million that you described is being paid for by the, let me call it abstract, I know it's not correct, but by the British taxpayer.
John Bull.
By John Bull, precisely by the Lego. Yeah. So that would not be part of the reparation claim. That is something that, for whatever political reasons and for whatever the political culture that allows the British to, within the parliament, within the society, to extract from one sector within the economy in favor of another, is very strongly related to the state of slavery, to the place of slavery in England, but economically speaking, this is a different pot.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's my question.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, it's not a question.
Okay. Yeah. Good. I have still 2 questions, 3, 4. I'm not sure. I'm looking at the audience, and everybody must be exhausted by now. It's almost 6 o'clock. Can you handle it to do 4 more questions? Is that all right for you? Okay. Then Françoise Vergès, then Bruno in the back, Mercedes, and Lydia.
Okay, thank you, Françoise Vergès. Did the British government use the argument of preserving order in the colony? That was one of the arguments the French used also, that they needed to give compensation to the slave owner to preserve order in the colony. That was among the arguments used by the second thing is, did you find record of free colored who own slave receiving compensation? Then also, was there a connection between the rewriting of history of slavery and conservative politics at home in England itself? Just a case, for instance, in France, part of the money the French took from Haiti, when France asked a ransom to recognize the sovereignty of Haiti, was paid to compensate the aristocrat who had fled France during the French Revolution, and to bring them back in France and to say they will receive money for the property they had lost under the French Revolution, and that money was paid by the money coming from Haiti. That kind of circulation of money. Was it also a case in England? And then finally, it's more so what you were saying about the case for redress. I was thinking about the case of Mauritius, the example of Mauritius, where the Mauritian government looked also at what they could do to redress, the inequalities in Mauritian society. So they did not ask the British anything. They looked what they could do, and they finally, she was at the conference, yeah. Our friend was at the conference. So they finally decided after a commission, the Truth and Justice Commission, for education, more education in the textbook, in the schools about slavery, language, the Creole language being recognized, and the third thing, that redistribution of land, the land that was owned by the Mauritian government being redistributed to the descendant of slaves. So that's also, I think, is interesting to look when we look at the policy of redress, to look also at what has been done in these countries, because we tend to dismiss them among the case. And finally, Catherine, do you think the initiative of the Greens in the European Parliament today will help? The Greens are asking that the European community recognize slave trade and slavery crimes against humanity.
I'm sorry, I haven't...
The Greens, les Verts, the Green movement, the Green movement, is as an initiative in the European Parliament right now, asking the European Parliament to recognize slave trade and slavery crime against humanity.
Okay. These were actually 5 questions, and I would like also to give the floor. Hopefully you can talk about this in the break. I have Bruno Jones in the back, but maybe we go from the front to the back and we end there. So Lydia first, and then Mercedes, and then Bruno.
I was very much interested in the comment on the emotional dimension of the legacy and maybe a strategy of emotional mapping. So my question would be, could you just tell us a little bit more about that? And I have just a small suggestion for a book that is the book written by Isabel Allende, The Island Under the La Isla del Mar, the island under the sea. I think that's a very excellent book in which is very very well written. This whole interconnectedness between the economic, the political, the emotional, the physical, the spiritual, and everything that I think that really is what colonialism and slavery was about. Thank you.
Half of my question is already being asked by you. Thank you so much. I was also interested in to hear more about the emotional mapping. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more if there are any practical programs addressing memory work in England. And also I would like to know more about what is memory work actually. Because I think with the commemoration of the abolishment of slavery, we have lots of new events taking place that have never taken place before in the Netherlands. New plays, new theaters. There's even een bedevaart, hoe zeg je dat in Engels? There's a pilgrimage now every year where people go and commemorate at a burial place, a graveyard where where we discovered an enslaved person who's buried there. Are there things like that happening in England, and what are they? And is that memory work?
Shall I say something? Okay, I'll be very quick.
Okay. You mentioned very briefly that despite of the austerity measures in Great Britain, you were still able to do your research project and get the funding. And we had serious cutbacks, serious cutbacks in the post-colonial field in the Netherlands. Many institutions are, disappear because they don't receive government funding any longer. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the economics of critical knowledge production in Great Britain. Is there a threat, a political threat to these kind of critical research projects, and how do you operate in a political field that is conservative and maybe also a historical field that is conservative?
Okay, I'm going to be very quick and just pick up some things, and maybe you'll say something too, Dienke, about. I think it is important to say that one of the things about British Empire records is that because, in theory, all peoples are equal, they don't record the color of the skin. So, and in theory, the way that the franchise is organized across the British Empire is it's organized on the basis of property, not on the basis of color. So, and of course, it just so happens that most people of color don't own enough property in the 19th century to get the vote. But only in South Africa does a vote come in, which is, a form of enfranchisement, which is actually on the basis of race. So the records, the only ways in which we can identify, for the most part, who are people of mixed race descent are through working things out. It very, very rarely tells us. But we do know we're discovering a lot more people, and we're discovering usually through other people's references to seeing a black woman or whatever it might be in other kinds of sources, that the numbers of children of mixed race descent who are coming into Britain in the 19th century is really very substantial, both from the Caribbean and from India. And from the Caribbean, it's often because the fathers think they'll get better treatment, much better treatment in England or Scotland, lots of them go to Scotland, than they would in the Caribbean, where the color codes are so incredibly powerful. So that's a whole difficult area in terms of research. Then I wanted to say, well, I don't know, there are so many things I could say. Well, about, there's lots of memory work of the kinds that you're describing going on. Artists working, local community groups working, new walks being established like Esther's Walk, all over the place. Lots and lots of local initiatives. And one of the things that we feel is important about our project is the kind of democratization of historical knowledge which it enables, that anybody can go and type in a name or type in a place. You can search the database by place as well as by name. So you can put in, Lower Bridge North or whatever it might be, and if there are any references, it will come up. So, and local historians and family historians have been incredibly important to us. They have given us an enormous amount of information from the work that's been done. So the whole move, the whole development of family history, which is quite extraordinary in Britain. I mean, apparently, next to pornography, family history sites are the most visited on the web. I mean, there's a statistic for you. So, but a lot of that work is being done in relation to African Caribbean families, for example, and people are very generous in sharing knowledge. So our project is not just being done in the university, it is a much wider collaborative project. We have to check all the information that we're given, but since we went public, we've had about 300 or 400 substantive emails with information about people to add to our site. So this is, a huge thing, actually. So in terms of, this connects really to your question about critical work, because these are very hard times in British universities, very hard times indeed. But one of the things that you have to be The government's agenda is that we should all have what is called impact. So if you are engaged with the public, you can actually demonstrate impact, which of course, that wasn't quite what they had in mind when, I mean, they want impact with the business community. But, you know, there are many other communities that one can have impact with. And this is actually, we can justify and legitimate the kind of work that we're doing on the basis of these processes of democratization. And because the government is in favor of free access, which raises all kinds of complicated questions, but in this sense, it's important for us. So we have to seize what opportunities there are and use them in the ways we can to keep on critically engaging and doing really, really serious research work.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. We have taken up 10 minutes of your extra time, your free time, so thank you very much. I think this session had a real impact. I'm going to thank you both and give the presents and then give Rosie the last famous words to say.